now. Now, if you hit consent, that'll allow you to stay in the meeting. If you don't do that, as John said, it will actually throw you out. But you do have the option just to switch your camera off if you'd rather do that. And if anyone is at any point saying anything that they would rather absolutely wasn't on the recording, then if you ask me to pause it, I can pause the recording and restart it once you're finished, just to make that really clear as well. Okay. Sorry, John.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just hand over, as I say, to Lynn.
Thanks, John. The joys of technology, as I said earlier on, these things are sent to try us. So well done, and thank you everyone for joining today. I am a last minute substitution for a speaker, so you'll forgive me if I seem a bit rough, but yeah, I had, like others, as many carers have hidden conditions. So one of my conditions flared up this morning, and I'm currently sitting with an electric blanket and lots of pain relief. So I'll do my best to sort of keep on message. And just very quickly, I think John had asked me to reflect as an unpaid carer, which I am for my medically complex husband, Derek, who you won't see, but who knows very much I'm speaking about him today, and is happy for me to do that. Just to talk a little bit about where we are, and also just to talk about some of the reasons why really, while we're talking about the National Care Service and we're waiting for the response to the consultation, why really we cannot wait for change. So just like many other carers over the last year, my role has intensified, and I would say primarily as a nursing role in many cases now, and that means navigating, like many families, very complex systems, being the linchpin between many consultants and medical specialties. It means doing things like monitoring blood pressure, skin condition, a whole lot of stuff that you would see happening in a hospital setting. And by and large, we largely kept my husband out of hospital over the last 20 months until a few weeks back, when he became very, very ill, and we waited 5.5 hours for an emergency ambulance. So there's a perfect example of, I think, where we are and why change can't wait, is that we are dealing with a system, I think, and I want to use the word broken, but it's very broken just now. So over the last year and a half, we have seen the number of unpaid carers in Scotland increase to over 1 million, and that's about 20% of the population. And the reason for that is there are multiple reasons for that. So we saw last year a wholesale withdrawal of social care from many families. Families were left with either nothing or virtually nothing. And that happens often overnight. Many services remain unopened, even still. So we have valuable daycare services for people and families who have particularly complex needs, which are still shut. And we have seen really more being asked of families consistently, but without support to do that. So many carers remain unsupported, they remain unrecognised, and I would say that the action taken over the last year to support carers has been minimal at best. I don't think that at any point the contribution of family carers to the pandemic has been fully recognised. And in my case, certainly, I was often the one reason why my husband wasn't admitted to acute care on a number of occasions last year, because I agreed to do monitoring at home. So I think that lack of recognition of unpaid care is symptomatic really of how little we value social care in Scotland. And even with the Feely review that John mentioned, I think that the continued lack of recognition of why social care is so critical on many levels is exactly why we cannot wait for change. So just quickly, I want to kind of outline just 5 reasons why, while we look at reform for social care, while we look at what the future of social care in Scotland might be, that there are things that need to happen now. And we cannot wait for change. And there's a number of reasons for that. So reason one, really, at the very basic level, my own view is that there's now no longer a stable or secure social care safety net in Scotland. What we have doesn't even meet critical needs in many cases. And you'll have seen, many of you will have seen the news. we'll have stories and experiences of people having packages withdrawn even now. And these are people who often have the most complex needs. So we don't have a safety net anymore. We know what happened last year when many were left without critical support. And for my husband and I, there's been a gradual realization over this last year that should I get sick, and in the worst possible scenario, if I died from COVID, and that's a very real thought in our lives, is what happens to him, who looks after him. And I don't believe at this point in time there is anywhere safe for him. And so that has magnified the trauma that many families have faced. And for me, has often taken me to breaking point, is that I am the last line of defence from COVID. So that's a key reason, is that we have to recover social care. We have to look at how we get back. I don't even mean pre-pandemic things were bad, and they were bad, but how do we get back to some level of decent social care so people can actually live well and start to not be isolated and lonely, which is where we are just now. So the second reason that we cannot wait is that, as I said, we have to recover social care, and we're not doing that just now, not in any sense of that word. Many of you will have seen the work done by the Ferret and others during this last year on, for example, the impact of loss of care home packages and what that meant for families. So the care sector just now is in a pretty perilous state. The focus remains politically in the NHS, and social care becomes the Cinderella service in that scenario. So unless we fully invest properly in social care now, until we start to pay care workers decent wages and accept this needs to happen, then social care will never recover. And in that vein, we recently had the publication of the Winter Plan, which basically didn't touch any of the issues that I know many people in this room will understand and be facing. We can't wait for the National Care Service, however that is configured. Reason 3 is, and I would not be forgiven from fellow carers if I didn't say this, but there's a massive public health impact for unpaid carers just now, which I don't think is being discussed. A friend of mine's, I think he may be in this room, Shabana, had said during the pandemic that carers were a hidden workforce, and that's exactly what the case is, and we were unsupported during the whole pandemic. Carers and their families have faced trauma that many of us couldn't possibly imagine. You know, you're having to battle for things, including basic health services. And I've spoken to many carers over this last 20 months, some of whom have become suicidal, and that's not an overstatement, because the pressure has been unbearable. They are being asked to do more. Many are doing multiple caring roles, and in doing that, putting themselves at risk. And many will have given up work, and at no point will families have been asked what matters to you in that process. So for families, there's a level of recovery that needs to happen, and until we acknowledge that wider impact, that public health impact on families, I don't know that we can move on. And the work of people like Carers UK, the Fraser Valdin Institute, has laid out quite significantly what that evidence is and what it means for families. Reason 4, I think many of us recognise that the pandemic has multiplied the gender and other inequalities that exist in Scotland. And for women in particular, the last year has been hard, and the evidence in terms of women's role in unpaid care and the impact that has been significant. And social care has a crucial role to play in tackling inequality, and at this point in time, it's not in a fit state to do that. So even as the country tries to recover from COVID, there's been a lack of planning in social care, there's been a lack of investment and forward thinking, and we're now in this current perfect storm where people are being stuck in hospital, where people cannot get the support that they absolutely deserve, and that frankly cannot continue. So finally, the final kind of reason I want to sort of see why we can't wait and why we need to look at social care now is the need to rebuild trust and to rebuild hope. And many of the families I know and speak to are at a point where, you know, this time last year we had the hope of vaccines. we had the hope of recovery, you know, but that has just been frittered away, I think. And one of the reasons why, for many families and for myself, one of the things that happened in the summer was the decision was taken by politicians to live with COVID. And it's hard to even just outline what that has meant for many families, is that even with the vaccine, the risk in terms of having consistently high COVID levels means that life can never get back to normal again. And for many families, that's the reality, the simple reality. Living with COVID, that choice has had a massive impact on the kind of services that many of us rely on. It means that many families do not feel safe to return to normal life, and there is additional pressure in social care that doesn't have to be there. So when we hear ministers talking about recovery and a wellbeing recovery and a better system, at the moment, the hope for that, that reality seems very, very far away. So lastly, I guess, in finishing, for me, there remains no parity between the NHS and social care. When we hear politicians talking about COVID and COVID recovery, it's always a focus in the NHS, and social care is always last. And I don't believe that there's an understanding of how profoundly important it is for many of our families, and that we are at risk of ensuring people are persistently isolated, and that's unacceptable. So we'll probably talk about later on, John, a bit about what that needs to look like in terms of recovery. But for me, I think the Feely review remains the kind of focus for me, and that kind of shining light. And I'm not convinced the National Care Service consultation captured that Feely review. So I think that we need to keep going back to what that said and what that gave in terms of hope. And lastly, just to finish, I think in terms of one of the discussions we need to have is around how we fund social care sustainably. If we value social care as much as we say we do, we have to fund it. So, and I guess I hope perhaps that's part of one of the discussions that we would have, is around how we make sure that social care is never in the position it's been in over the last year. Thanks for your time. Thanks everyone for being here, and happy to take questions later on. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Some quite quite worrying implications from many of the things that you said there. You ended on the point of funding, and it was clearly one of the things that Feely said was that we need to switch from this feeling that that this is just a burden upon all of us, to a situation where we all recognise that this is a really important, positive thing, social care, and we need to see it as an investment. So did you have any hope that that was a message that was recognised?
I think I had hoped that it had been, John. And I guess as long as discussions remain open, that hope is still there. What I don't see at the moment properly are the voices of our families in those discussions at national level, the way they should be. There has been a kind of social contract group set up, which does involve families and disability and carers, but that's a sideshow. That's a sideshow. So the discussions around how things are funded, how the National Care Service will look, are being done by the Scottish Government and COSLA in main, and I don't see that my family and our families have a say in that. On a wider level, I work for GCVS, and we've done a huge series around called Our World Reimagined, and much of what I have said has been said by people in those sessions, which includes people who use social care. So the consultation that came out in the summer, for me, missed the point completely, and it focused largely on structure and processes and not on outcomes and on funding. And I think that if we continue down that route, we're in very grave danger of making the mistakes we did with integration. So I do have some hope still, and maybe sound pretty negative. That's probably because I am, but we've been here before, and I think we just need to not make the same mistakes again. And I think we're at real risk of doing that.
I guess another part of what you're saying is we've been here before, but in a sense, we haven't, because we haven't been here before post-COVID, or your point is not post-COVID. COVID's still with us. So we've been here before, but this is more complicated. This is more difficult this time. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think up to a point, yeah. I think the decision to live with COVID complicates things. You know, it has really ingrained the inequalities that many families faced. I don't think it's a coincidence that many of the services that are last to recover are those which disabled people rely on.
Yeah.
That carers rely on. And that says a lot about how little we value many of our families. And I think we're in a danger of tipping over a precipice that we can't return from. And the rights of people with disabilities and carers, I think, are on very thin ice just now. And I don't hear enough from politicians or government that suggest to me they understand truly where we are just now. I hope I'm wrong, but what I listen to, and I did as part of my job, I listen to a lot from my sons, is I hear focus on things like vaccine passports, which themselves have profound implications on equality, without understanding that for many of us, the thought of the chances of us actually going out and having a life are zero at the moment. So the vaccine passport is pretty much an old discussion. It's not around the wider structural issues that many of us are facing, and that's a shame.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Sam or Anne-Marie if they'd like to comment or respond to anything that Lynn has said.
Thanks, John. I was struggling a wee bit there to get my mic off. I suppose the question I have is, and we may come on to it later, but what would make it feel better and much more manageable for people?
Lynn, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, sorry. It's a hard one, Anne-Marie, isn't it? I mean, I think we're in such a mess just now that I don't know what. I think firstly, visibility. And what we're not seeing is visibility in policy just now. So the winter plan's a perfect example of that, where and interestingly, and myself and others are actually involved in a Scottish Government group which inputted to that plan, which we did, and none of it was taken up in terms of carer recovery from COVID. So firstly, I think visibility for our families at national level is critical. That it's that signalling, isn't it, that says that actually we do understand the challenges you're facing, and we want to respond to that. I would like to see something from the Scottish Government around accountability and challenging those partnerships which aren't recovering services. And it's easy to say, oh, that's local decisions. But at the end of the day, people's lives are being put on hold consistently and have been, in many cases, for more than 20 months now. I have friends whose disabled children have not had any social contact out with the home for 21 months now. And there's no sign of those services restarting. That's completely unacceptable. So I would want the Scottish Government to be doing more to get those services restarted. I would like to see a consistent social care recovery plan. I'm not seeing that. I think each partnership is doing their own thing, and that's fine. But where's the national oversight of that, and where's the national challenge? And things like, for example, better fund. So we had a chance to fund to pay social care workers a better salary, and twice we've ditched that at parliamentary level. And yeah, it comes down to money at the end of the day, but it comes back to your point, John, about what do we value here? Is social care valuable or is it not? And the sense I get is that it's not still.
Sam, you want to?
I think for me, and what I'm hearing from you, Lynn, is that the acknowledgement that everyone's experienced this, but not everyone's experienced this the same way. And Damien Barr had a great quote about we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. Some are in a super yacht and some are in a boat with no oar. And it's the folk who are in a boat with no oar that, you know, and others that idea that it's behind us. We hear this rhetoric when some people are absolutely still trapped in the reality of what it means if you've not got access to supports and services you had before, or you feel that other people are behaving in a way that it's behind them when it's not for you. So I think it is that active acknowledgement that this just has not been experienced in the same way. I was doing some other work about, just the mortality statistics for disabled people, and they acknowledge, I don't hear it and see it. So it feels a bit like it's niche because those of us who are really concerned about it are acutely aware, and others seem less concerned. And you would hope our politicians and others would show leadership.
Absolutely.
Greater leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we get back to the structural inequalities that I think we've all talked about that were there pre-pandemic. And you're right to point out that the bulk of people who died sadly during the pandemic were people with disabilities and long-term conditions. We lost my dad during the pandemic, not because of COVID, because of various things that went on, and I still class him as a COVID statistic because he died during the pandemic and he died alone, and many of us face those traumas. And I think you're right, it's that kind of lack of acknowledgement of if you do get a chance, with GCVS we did a session with Janine, I forget Jane's second name, from Wellbeing Scotland in June around trauma and recovery from COVID. And it was a real eye opener of a session for me because we talked about the trauma that many families have faced. And it's like battling, living a war every day. That's the best way I can describe it. Is it's like the trauma of living in a battle and a war for many families, and that hasn't changed. And I don't get the sense that our government understand, as you say, have understood that. And maybe that's part of the recovery, is the change now is they have to acknowledge that what you said, we're not on, and some of us aren't even in a boat, we're drowning. So yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Lynn. I'm going to ask Anne-Marie if she would like just to kind of make her statement for today, the things she's been reflecting on in relation to today's proposition that we can't afford to wait another 5 years. And Anne-Marie was describing before the various perspectives that she brings and various roles she occupies. So it'll be interesting to get her take on that.
Thanks very much, John. And people will know me in a variety of roles, whatever role you know me in. Forget all that because I'm here giving you my views. So I'm not representing the Health Board, I'm not representing SASWA, I'm not representing Community Brokerage or ILF or any of those organisations. I'm just giving you some of my own reflections here. And I say that as someone who did work in the local authority as well for a number of years, in fact spent now over 40 years working in social work, but actually my heart lies in the community because my very initial training way back was as a community worker. So I think, once a community worker, always a community worker kind of thing. And I find it difficult to lose that. So I've been reflecting, and I think there's 6 things that jump out at me around the National Care Service and perhaps why we need to think about the time frame of all of this. And the first thing that strikes me is that tension between what people who use services want and what professionals want. And it is quite clear that what we've got is many people who use services really concerned that what we've got now isn't fit for the purpose as they see it. And I also use PA, so I put myself in that group, recognising some of the struggles and challenges that I've had over the years. And looking for something that's different, something that needs to be better. And I think, like many people, we're putting our hope in a new National Care Service and the hope that it will change things and make it better than what we've currently got. I know, however, that there are different views amongst professionals. Some people support it, some people don't support it. And then there's the debate about what should be in a National Care Service, what shouldn't be in it. people were taken by surprise with the kind of extended view, or the extended options in the consultation that looked at whether children's services or justice services should be included in a new national care service. And that seemed to take people by surprise because there was no clear evidence base for that being included. And other people would say you couldn't involve some parts of social work without involving all the social work functions. So, and the jury's out in some of that, and I'm sure that will be evident in the responses that come back. But I think what is clear is that whether it's a new national care service, what that new national care service looks like, none of us really knows at this stage. There's some hints of it, if you like, in the consultation. But I think what is clear is that people are saying we need change. We absolutely need change. And therefore, I think we all have responsibility in the various roles that we play to try and influence what that change would look like so that we can be assured that it will be for the better. So that first point for me was around the tension between what people who use services might want and what professionals might want, or that could be rephrased of what they think people might need. And we just, we need to think about that in the context of the role that they play. Second point for me was around the community health and social care boards. And there is some concern about the loss of the kind of local democratic processes. And for me, that brings into question the current IGB structure that we have just now. So I sit on Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. I'm appointed by the Minister. Being on that health board means I'm then appointed to an IGB. So I sit on Glasgow IGB, and I have chaired, I'm currently the vice chair of East Renfrewshire IGB. I do not live in either of those areas. I live in Cardross, which is right on the cusp between Weston Barton and Argyll and Bute. I don't live in Glasgow. I don't live in East Renfrewshire, and yet I have responsibilities for those areas. I have votes over what happens in those areas, and people who live in those areas don't have a vote. So that tells me there's something wrong with that local democratic process as it currently stands. And I know there are the elected members who feature there and they have a vote. I understand all of that. But the thing that attracts me about the new community health and care boards is the idea that local people will have greater influence and greater say, and that what we might get here is some participative politics. And that has to be better than the current arrangement, because I know with my community work background, I feel uncomfortable sitting on those boards. I absolutely do my best in that role, but I can tell you there are people sitting around that table that should have more of a right and a view about what happens in their areas than I do. So for me, there's just something about the current structure that doesn't work. So anything that looks at that and revisits that has to be a good thing. What it does do, I think, is bring in some question about what then happens about the local authorities. What remains for the local authorities to have control over? If health goes, if social care goes, and if we've already seen all sorts of values and things, the arm's length organisations that have replaced directly provided services, whether it's leisure services or whatever. The big question then is, what is the future of local authorities, and therefore what is that wider future around local democracy? So there's something in there, if you like, that makes me feel uncomfortable, but makes me feel quite excited that we could get it better and we could do it differently. But we need to be really clear about what's central politics and what's local politics, and the interface between these two will be absolutely crucial. So we can be assured that we're going to have some disruption ahead, because if they are going to change those structures, it will be bumpy and it will be disruptive for people who both work in those organisations, but also who are in receipt of any kind of service or budget or whatever for their social care. So I think this big thing around for me, those new boards. The third area for me is self-directed support, which is supposed to be the pillar on which we will build and drive forward any improvements. The SDS that we see now in practice bears absolutely no resemblance, I don't believe, to the one that we were advocating as a group way back 10 years ago. My colleague Margaret Wheatley and I ran the first test site, and the role I had back then as head of LD in Glasgow with Margaret. for SDS, and we had lots of debates, lots of ethical discussions. We involved finance. Sam, you may well have been around at that time as well. We involved finance, we talked to providers, we did all sorts of things. And now we've got something called SDS that bears no resemblance to those initial intentions. We're very lucky, we've got fantastic legislation, but it still bears no resemblance to that legislation. And I think if we're going to build a system that's on the premise of SDS, then let's get SDS right. And that means let's go back to those original intentions. And it is about people themselves micro-commissioning what kind of support that they want in their lives. And it is about making sure that the resources are there to allow people to do that, because in the end of the day, it's about exercising their rights. So for me, there's a big thing about what do we really mean by SDS and what kind of SDS are we building on? I hope to goodness it's not the current SDS that's in practice, but it will be the SDS that we all originally intended way back. I think for me, there's something for me about the consultation when it asks about the executive directors of nursing having a role in care homes and words to that effect. And you know, when I was reading that, I'm thinking, does that mean there's going to be a split in the health service? Does that mean that we'll have all the kind of hospital care, acute services, secondary care in the hospitals and everything else that's based in the community? Is that all going to come under a new national care service? And if it does, who should have responsibility for which bits of it? The thing that strikes me in all of this is that health seems to be given quite a dominant role in this, and it made me question, where is the role of the Chief Social Work Officer in this? Because actually, the danger here is that we move towards much more medical models of support for people, and I'm going to come back to that. So yeah, I am really concerned about where social work will sit in a national care service. It's based on, you know, it's got pretty strong values. It's based on human rights and the principles of social justice. And therefore, if it's going to be dominated by health, my concern is that we will lose a lot of what makes social work special and a lot of what then supports the social care structure and the social care work that goes on in our communities. Because while we're very much, and I'm very much in support of community-based responses, I think we need to recognise that sometimes people need formal support in the form of paid support, and amongst all those other things. So I guess for me, I think, you know, let's keep nurses to health, and let's keep social workers and social care workers to social work and social care, and let's not get them confused, because I think there is a danger here that we end up with medical models of care when in fact, in terms of the independent living movement, we have people have really fought for their rights to be citizens and take up all that they're entitled to by virtue of their very existence, because they're human beings, and we're in danger now of putting people back into wee boxes and producing what are perceived to be new models of care, which is basically residential care and all sorts of things that are just being rehashed and delivered and badged as something else. And I am really concerned that that's the way that we begin to drive this agenda. And it will be because, you know, health isn't about hanging in there for the long term with people. It is about fixing people and putting them back out again. Social work and social care is not about that. It's about hanging in for that long relationship that you build up with somebody. And I would hate to think that we lose that in any new arrangement. The fifth point, I guess, is the brokerage. Community brokerage is mentioned in the National Care Service. And I've been a big fan of brokerage, and we've done a lot of work down in the Ayrshires along in terms of brokerage. And, you know, as it currently stands, social workers find that their work is driven towards crisis intervention, and they don't get to do the early intervention preventative work. So what happens is that gets picked up elsewhere, and it has been picked up in the third sector over recent years. But again, I think we see there is some danger here that some of this gets picked up with health. So for example, as a community worker, who spent a lot of my early years working in communities with people who experienced all sorts of discrimination, disadvantage, prejudice, whatever. I hear terms of social prescribing by your GP. I'm just like, what is that about? You know, and I that concerns me. You know, if we invest in communities and we put our resources into communities, we wouldn't need health services to be prescribing these things. People should be able to directly access them in a universal way. So I've got some real concerns about, you know, what do we mean by the way in which we expect people to access services? Are we going to have to go through health routes? Are we going to have to go through formal routes of social work? Are we going to have to go through other routes? Why can't people just access things that you and I do without the need to be some gatekeeping? Because the current gatekeeping arrangements means that social workers are expected to advocate for the people they support and yet at the same time gatekeep resources. I met with some carers a few weeks ago and they said to me, Anne-Marie, social workers are great and you get good social workers, you get social workers that aren't as good and the same as in any profession. But what happens, they said to me, was you can't have a social worker who's a gatekeeper and your advocate. It just doesn't work. And I agree with that, it doesn't work. So we really need to think, what is it we expect social workers to be doing in our world, in our new world? And what is it we expect other people to be doing? And what are the differences between social work, social care, the third sector and whoever? And what do we all do all together? But we need some clarity about those roles. And the final point for me is just that point on the charging of social care. So people who have disabilities, myself included, are the only people, the only marginalised group that have to pay out of their own pocket to remove the barriers that cause various amounts of discrimination and prejudice that prevent them getting on with their life. So no other marginalised group needs to pay for that out of their own pocket. So it's not unknown for people to pay, you know, 400, 500, 600 pounds a month towards their social care costs. And I'm a great believer that we really need to revisit all of that. And the other bit in there that concerns me is the way, think of myself, for example, an independent woman all my life, as you can imagine. Lots of folks say, I feel sorry for your man. And we do have a laugh about that. But one of the things that's important there is my income is assessed for my charge and my contribution. But you know what? I've always been financially independent, etc., all of my life. And suddenly this person that I'm married to is also having to not only deal with the fact that his partner now has a disability, but he's got the joy of paying for it as well. So there's something in there for me around how we attribute charges, and should we even be charging folk for this, because no other marginalised group is responsible for paying themselves to remove those barriers. So that's my spiel. Happy to take any questions, and I hope it's raised some thoughts in your own heads. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne-Marie. I'll just make sure. Yeah, I am unmuted. So, yeah, touched on a huge amount of things there, from the nature and future of social work through to local democracy, community. I guess you're articulating a lot of things you would like to see be present when the new system is invoked. Are there any of those things that you think we could be more immediately, creatively engaging with now?
Absolutely, John. I think social work is in crisis in Scotland as a profession. Social work is in crisis. And I think we need to look very closely at that. I don't think for a minute that young people coming out of universities as social workers are doing the job that they thought they would be doing. And therefore, I think we, from what I understand, and I don't have the source of it with me right now, I understand that social workers, once they graduate and move into work in social work, have a lifespan of 7 years before they chuck it. I think that is just shocking. That tells us there's something seriously wrong with what they're being asked, what they're being prepared to do and what they're being asked to do. And I think there's a real dissonance in there. And I think we can begin to address that now. We don't need to wait for a national care service for that.
Good, thank you very much. Sam, Lynn, you want to come in at all?
Yeah.
Anything you say?
There was a couple of things there that I would be interested in considering further. I kind of have a greater aspiration about us influencing health to say not good enough. Medical model for health is not good enough when we know poverty is one of the social determinants of ill health. So we need to occupy, we need to step into that space and say, you know, it's not, we have to move beyond the individual in the Petri dish view of health. So I say step into that and demand better of our health service around that, and that is about the social model. In terms of the social work profession, I listened to Hilary Cottam lecture pod thing. I don't know what it was, but I listened to it and I thought it was really good. And she actually talked about social care as a craft or an art. And I just think what joy it should be for social care professionals to exercise their craft of problem solving alongside people instead of trying to manage budgets as the primary filter through which you see. Now, this isn't naive that, you know, there's loads of money, but we squander so much money in a system that squeezes people's imagination and creativity and problem solving out of it. And that and so for professionals working in the system, it's an abusive and unproductive system. Good people trying to do good work, lasting 7 years and then running, and for people who use it, it doesn't work. So if we know that, then yeah, we just have to do better.
Thanks, Sam. Can I come back on that, John, if that's okay?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
I'm certainly not advocating that we don't work alongside health colleagues, and I sit on the health board. So I suppose what I'm saying is health is a massive, certainly Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board is a massive organisation, and health is a massive, employs plenty of folk, does wonderful things for people, and I get all of that. The danger we have is that social work is such a small profession that it becomes dominated by health models, and what happens is the power balance is all wrong. So my concern in this is that social work is recognised for the contribution that it brings and for the value that it brings, and that it's not seen as an added or an extra add-on, if you like. So that's my only concern about the balance of that power in those relationships in any new structure, that we don't have all of those senior posts with, you know, occupied by, you know, health, nursing executive directors or whoever, and that we don't have social work leadership up there as well. So I suppose that's where I'm coming from on that. In relation to the point about, you know, sometimes we drive out creativity, I actually think you're spot on. You know, the lack of money should actually drive us to be much more creative. What prevents that happening, I think, is the vast amounts of bureaucracy in the current system. So in SDS, it creates an opportunity for much more creative use of money and micro commissioning, if you want to call it that, or whatever. But what happens is we get rules that are made up on the hoof. We get blockages and obstacles put in place. We're sold that story and that narrative all the time about this is public money and we need to account for it. All of the money in public services is public money. What makes social work even more, what makes it that in social work we need to scrutinise it even more? And that's my concern. I think people with individual budgets have their budgets unfairly scrutinised, and quite often they're easy pickings because they can often be people who are not in a position to fight for themselves, which again is why that role of social workers in an advocacy function is absolutely critical in this.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to go to Lynn, and then we'll go. Then I'll just Frances a wee alert that we'll go to her for a wee summary of what's been said in the chat, etc. after Lynn.
don't know if Sam got his type. You've got Sam's presentation as well, I think, John, as well, haven't you?
Yes,
So I'll be
yeah,
very
yeah.
quick. Sorry, just I think what could be changed now. Don't disagree with what's been said at all. I'm sitting there cheering Anne-Marie and Sam on, going, yeah. It's that, do you know? But this is what's missing, is a strategic overview of all of this. We're pulling together all of the challenges that exist just now, and I don't think that was in the National Care Service consultation, that overview. But anyway, what do we change now? We start working with families. And the gatekeeping stuff is just the most horrific thing that we know. I've been sitting in a number of meetings with health and social care colleagues through my role, and my response is say yes more often. Don't say no, just say yes. How much money is wasted by people saying no to something that actually doesn't cost a huge amount of money, but has a massive impact in people's lives. I'm watching the chat around the whole charging thing. Absolutely, that has to go. Interestingly, I heard Stuart Curry from COSLA at an event recently, and COSLA have come a long way on this and are talking about this, which they weren't doing a few years back. So charging has to go. Jim, your point about charging for aids and adaptations, absolutely. I think there's an issue there about what we charge for and what's removed. And lastly, I think what we need to do immediately is about rebuilding trust in the system, because many families don't trust the system, and I'm one of them. I don't want social work anywhere near my husband because they don't understand his needs. Our limited contact with them has been horrific, and including one social worker who was assessing us for SDS saying in front of my husband, if you want respite, he goes into care. Now that's the kind of stuff you're dealing with. Now that's obviously someone who shouldn't be in the system, but that issue of trust is critical for many families. And we don't see that talked about often enough.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lynn. I think that echoes a lot of things that Frances and I have heard in our dealings with families up and down the country in recent times in relation to their struggles with SDS and that kind of abrasive, aggressive, negative contact that they have with social work.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think social workers are now often perceived as punishers of people, which I think is the saddest indictment of that, which should be a profession that's about enabling people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, 1976, I became a social worker. So it's sad that the reputation of that profession is so tarnished at the moment, isn't it? Frances.
Sorry, I was just going to say, John, I think what saddens me is I worked in a profession, which is what I originally trained in, is community work, and that no longer exists. And I think there's a danger that social work goes the same way.
Yeah.
And that's why I think I'm holding on to it so tightly. It's got great potential, but it's not functioning how it should. And I wouldn't disagree with what anybody said negatively about it.
Yeah, thank you. Frances, I'm going to go to you. I know other people have their hands up and we'll try and get to them in due course, but
I did get kicked out for a wee bit, so
yes, I know.
I might have a wee bit of blank periods, which is just my normal day, really. But I think there's been a lot of good conversation and a lot of conversation about the charges, the care charges, and I think frustration because we've been expecting those to go. And when you think about what could be happening now, obviously that's something that should just be happening, and we've had promises, political promises around that, and some optimism in some of the comments that have been made that it's going to happen sooner than we think. In terms of some of the things around those people in those leadership roles that Anne-Marie was talking about, there's comments there about not just the professionals, but people with lived experience. When are we empowering the people with the lived experience to get into those leadership roles, and how do we make sure that happens? Because it isn't just about the professionals. There's quite a bit of, a conversation and comments around health, that idea that the imbalance of health suddenly are taking, over the leadership role within social care or the new care system. And I think people are just worried about that. I think Simon wrote, you can't prescribe community. And you can't prescribe a life. We've spent years trying to help people move away from this whole idea that it's just about your needs to it's actually about a good life, as Anne-Marie was describing, even in her own life. It's, to expect that somehow health where they haven't been on the same journey, with all due respect. It's a different place that they'd be starting from, even if they did it with the good intent. I think they'd be coming from in a very different place. So we could be losing everything that we've worked really hard around self-directed sports. So those are some of the things that seem to be coming through in the.
Thank you. That's great. So I'm just trying to balance out the time we've got left and what we need to do. I'm going to go quickly to Heather and to Linda, who've had their hands up for a while, just to check out your thoughts, what you're hearing. Heather.
Just to touch on what everyone what's been saying, and obviously what I'm really saying. Hi, my name is Heather, and I am a member of the League of Scotland, and I was approached this morning by Gary Ames to come on to this call, and so thankful that he did, because obviously I'm looking to get in my own place, and I'm social work about SDS and support, and because I live with my mum and dad, I'm not critical enough.
Right.
And obviously one touched on it earlier and said disabled people's services are going to be cut and stuff, and obviously Annalise just said that like social work and I have to totally agree with what Annalise said, and I think social work are not getting to do their job, because obviously they're doing it on a critical basis, and because I'm not critical enough for this support for this SDS, even though I am looking to get my own place, and just unfortunately our SDS coordinator's not here today, otherwise we've got a lovely coordinator called Lauren, who is absolutely amazing, who I'm working with, and I can't fault her enough, Jan, you'll be happy to hear that, yeah.
I know Lauren, and she is really good, so
yeah. So I totally agree with what you said, Glenn, and what you said, Anne-Marie, about SDS, because I'm definitely looking at getting my own place, and I'm finding it really hard to get support right now. Yeah.
I guess one of the things here is that shouldn't be denied you getting your own place. That should be top of the list for you getting your own home. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to go to Linda. Linda Riley.
Thank you. I just want to make a couple of points in addition to what I've been listening to this morning. First of all, SDS was mentioned. I've been horrified recently. It wouldn't be appropriate to go through all the ins and outs of this one, but I can say that I was requiring a stair lift, and there are lots of things behind that. It was refused initially, and I said, no, that's ridiculous. You've already put one in 11 years ago. It's broken down. I need it either repairing or replacing. And they wouldn't do that. They wanted me to go downstairs and not use the rest of my own house. And so all this was going on. But I had an OT out the other day to assess me properly, really, and find out what the situation was. And she said, oh, yes, you would qualify for a stair lift, most definitely. You need a curved one as well, and that would be absolutely right. And, oh, yes, you definitely come under this. But she said, I can't really do very much, though, because the local authority will just turn it down. So I said, well, I don't understand part of this, because I am in receipt of SDS, and SDS has a legislation, and in that legislation it says that if there is anything that I am requiring to enable me to be independent, etc., in other words, any equipment or anything, and I said it's clearly clearly stated in the SDS legislation.
Mhm.
I know this, I'm on the board for SDS Forth Valley.
Right.
And I was told that by this lovely OT, and she said, I'm afraid the local authority don't recognise the legislation at all. I don't know how many more legislations they're not recognising,
Yeah.
but I find this very frightening.
Mhm.
And secondly, I agree, there are these social workers just coming out of university. They're going to get a big shock when they realise that they just got to do the kind of job where they go in and visit people and do assessments and start to try to get a relationship, trying to build up what their needs are
Mhm.
and trying to look at that person. But of course, person-centered's gone out of the window now.
Yeah.
I'm shocked about it, more shocked because I actually worked for 35 years with people with disability myself.
Mhm.
And now I look and find that the local authority just turned down a lot of the recommendations that social workers and OTs, etc., are
Mhm.
making. So these both support social work people in the social work department have got a problem because they're not recognised and listened to. And I feel it's time local authority got sorted out because people are at risk out there. They're in a serious risk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I think your points are really important about the statement of intent that's in the legislation about independent living and how that is largely being ignored. I think that's a really important point that you're drawing out. Sam, I'm going to come to you and ask you, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I wonder if you could take us through your input for today, and then we'll come to our sort of concluding part of the
Okay. No problem. I'll go through it fairly quickly so that there is the opportunity to ask questions. I had pulled together some slides. We'll start at the beginning, possibly. Just some slides because I thought you might be exhausted by voices by this time in the day. So just to say, I'm going to talk about human rights and social care, and it really touches on so much of what we've already discussed today. Can I click on these, or is someone else going to click on them for me? Oh, right. So just to be clear, about human rights, I'm often surprised that people are not aware of human rights and how it connects us all. So I thought this would be a useful quote. Human rights are equal rights. One either is or is not a human being, and therefore has the same human rights as everyone else, or none at all. So if we have them or we don't as human beings, they're also inalienable rights, which means you cannot stop being human, no matter how badly one behaves or how barbarously one is treated. So human rights apply to everybody. It's not a judgment on whether you're a good person or a not good person. Everybody has them by dint of birth. And I think that's incredibly unifying. So if we move on to the next, and the thing that I'm really passionate about is human rights are about courts and lawyers, but they're more than that. They're actually about how we engage with each other in as Eleanor Roosevelt would say, in those small places close to home, because that's where they begin. So she said, where after all do universal human rights begin? In the small places close to home. And this is, I suppose, my clarion call through Eleanor Roosevelt, which says, unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we will look in vain for progress in the larger world. Well, that to me tells us what we can do on an individual level. We don't have to wait and look to our governments and others. We can inform ourselves about our rights. We can campaign about our rights. We can use the language of human rights to discuss the issues that we're experiencing. And so we have them, we can exercise them, and we can use our human rights together to try and bring about change. So next slide, please. Social care for me, and I'm sure for others, it's what we've been talking about. It's not a series of services. It's actually a web of support that we all should invest in. It's important to all of us. None of us know when we may need to access it. All of us are going to get older unless something else happens. So we should be all invested in improving our social care supports for those currently using it, and being allies of those who are currently using it and want it to improve. But even just for a selfish motivation, you know, if we can't think in support of others, it is something that, in the same way as we consider our health service to be there for us, regardless of whether we have long-term conditions and use it frequently, we know it's there for when we need it. And we should view social care, the web of support. This is a cosmic web, because I started using the spider's web and I thought that's actually the opposite of what we want. It should be tailored around the individual, but it's actually about our interconnectedness on a societal level. So if we can move on to the next slide. I began to try and think about social contracts and social covenants, because for me, human rights spans the range. The social contract is our arrangement, our agreement with our governance, our government, our state, which for me, that would take into account the laws we have on statutes. So the need for us to further incorporate some of the UN human rights conventions, so that we can go to courts now, our domestic courts, and be able to challenge if we think our rights aren't being upheld. That happens at a kind of government level, the state level. And so we all, I believe, should be championing the incorporation of further human rights conventions, in the same way as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is in the process of being incorporated, but the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, conventions around economic and social and cultural rights, all of these would mean that we would have a national level a suite of laws that allowed us as citizens to challenge the state when it's not supporting us around these things, these basic conditions for leading a good life. But as well as that, we have a social covenant, which is how we choose to interact together. And that's where I think there's real power in human rights, because we can use this as a language of connection. It's a language of connection between ourselves as human beings, in our communities, in our nation, but also internationally. There's tremendous power in knowing we've signed up to these human rights and these conventions. And what it sometimes takes for me, I believe, is we get into, well, what should we be aiming for? Let's have a long discussion about, what's the outcome we're trying to achieve. We've got UN conventions around how written in the case of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that detail what disabled people have said themselves would lead to a good life. We don't need to recreate this. We don't need to reinvent it. We've got it sitting there. Let's use that and aim towards that. So if you could move on to the next one for me, please. I think then what we do is we talk in our collective sense about what we have in common, and we have a common aim to try and work towards. And then it means the measure of whether something is good or not, whether it's any of the suggestions around the National Care Service, does it take us nearer or further away, the achievement of those human rights? That's the measure. And because we've got a common language about it, we've already signed up to it. We don't have to negotiate these things. We just say, no, we know this is what leads to the conditions for a good life. So, I mean, I don't think it's simplistic. It's incredibly complex and sophisticated, but we've kind of done the bulk of the work, because these things already exist. Is for us to manifest them. It's for us to make them real by the way we engage with each other about it individually. So we're powerful in this, but also about how we ask the questions of others using that language, so that we make it harder for people to slip out the side or pretend they don't know. It already exists. So this is my plea. I think if we move on to the next one, the next slide, that we use human rights as they're articulated. They're already there. We use them as our North Star, because the North Star is a direction of travel. It's not the destination. And we already have these incredibly powerful conventions written. What we need to do is ensure that they're incorporated so that we can wrestle with them on a local level, and so that we can get accountability, because that's one of the things that currently doesn't exist in Scotland, is an accountability about the realization of people's human rights. But that's part of the journey. That's part of our argument. That's part of us using that language every day to make that happen. That was a quick canter through. That's the last slide.
That was great. Thank you very much, Sam. I think that gave us a powerful kind of pulling together of some of the strands that we've been thinking about in the course of the last hour and a half. I saw somebody else put in the chat there that a lot of things seem to boil down to people just being denied their rights. So this kind of insistence that no, we know what our rights are. Let's just measure the future system, the present system, against whether or not they're being respected, and it maybe gives us a different way of talking, as you say, to each other and to the powers that be, the government, etc. We've got a few minutes left, and I kind of sense that there's a whole lot of people would love to come in and discuss and debate. I'm going to confine it, however, just to our two guests who led us off today, and just see if Lynn or Anne-Marie want to comment on Sam's presentation.
Thanks, John. I'd love the chance to come in, Sam. That was really helpful, and I love the illustration of the North Star being the direction of travel. Just realised my camera was off. I love the North Star being the direction of travel. It's just brilliant. It's like a wee guide up there, and we just keep that in our mind and always remind ourselves of that. So thank you. There is something in there for me about that responsibility that comes with people who are employed in local authorities generally, and about their responsibility. So if I think about social workers, and I have talked a lot about social workers today, so forgive me for that, but they carry a lot of responsibility in this, right?
Yeah.
They have legal duties here, and I suppose my issue is, how can we enforce some of them to take responsibility for those legal duties when with their failure to do that denies us our human rights?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that tension, isn't it? Like they're often the gateway to all of this, for accessing what we need to live our life to the full, and yet at the same time they don't take that responsibility seriously, or you're just denied it because there's a lack of resources. So there's something about how can we force people to take those responsibilities seriously?
Very
Well,
much.
and equally, how so I think enforcing it is important, because that's it. You always have to get that when people won't otherwise.
Yeah.
But imagine if we created a system where people knew it was part of their obligation to ensure that people's rights were respected and protected, and they knew that their own professional bodies would be saying, this is what you're measured against. Are you supporting people to deliver on their human rights? Has your practice actually undermined that? Now, so I would love to get to a place where we didn't have to enforce it, because people knew that that's what their job was about.
I think that's brilliant. And I think what happens just now is their success of people is measured against their budgetary control. So we're measuring the wrong things for success. And I can't remember, I think it might have been Jim Elder Woodward who said earlier on about the need to build that capacity among people themselves so that we can self-advocate and that there's a real strength in all of that. I remember fairly recently asking Kevin Stewart, the Minister, about, you know, when we think about the National Care Service and when you get all those responses in, what weighting will you give to the responses from people who have lived and living experiences and they're experts by that experience, as opposed to you know, professionals who work in that? And he absolutely assured me that more weighting, you know, would be given to those with lived experience. And I don't know that I believe that, right? Sorry, but because we've been sold that pup before, right? So there's something for me about building that capacity up so that we've got a groundswell of people who know their rights and who can advocate for their rights and who can hold the government, irrespective of what political party it is, to account for what happens on the ground. So thanks, Sam.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time has come and gone. I'd just like to thank everyone who's participated today, who's been presenting their thoughts and ideas, or who's been just present in the room or sharing ideas in the chat. Our apologies for the technical stuff at the beginning, but from a Radical Vision's point of view, it's good to have this launch now behind us. We can, what we want to do is share all the and collate all the ideas and information that's been generated today. We'll be writing that up, we'll be communicating that across the field of social care, amongst the groups of people who use social care and the people who deliver it, the people who govern it. And we'll be, as I said at the beginning, trying to move forward with a range of discussions that keep these ideas alive from month to month, so that we don't just have a quick splurge and then forget about it. With that in mind, Monday the 13th of December, we'll have our second pre-Christmas seminar, and the topic is going to be the right to live in your own home, deinstitutionalization, the Coming Home report, etc. How are we going to deliver on those things, which, similar to lots of things discussed today, have long been promised, and which research and good practice determines is also the way to go, alongside human rights. So please join us for that if you can, and thank you very much for being part of this. Special thanks to our guests today, to Sam, to Anne-Marie and to Lynn, and thanks to Gary for coping with the chaos in the background, and good afternoon. Thank you very much.